Let's turn our Bibles to the 17th chapter of Matthew, if you haven't done that yet. Matthew chapter 17, we got through the first 9 verses last week. We're going to pick up with verse 10 today. And in chapter 16, Peter had tried to tell Jesus to take the easy road. If you remember that, he said, "Far be it from you, Lord, and don't let this ever happen to you." He tried to get Jesus to take the easy road instead of going to Calvary. And in the first half of chapter 17, or the first part of it, Jesus gave a glimpse of what would be accomplished at the cross through the transfiguration that we looked at last week. Chuck Spurgeon, I'm going to probably give a couple of him today. He said, "There will be no crown wearers in heaven who are not cross bearers here below." And just think about what he's saying there. Now, let me tell you what he's not saying, okay? He's not saying that you won't be there if you're not a cross bearer. He's not saying that you won't be in heaven. He's just saying you're going to be lidless, okay? You won't have a crown. And you'll be dome challenged, I guess you could say. And I'm going to come back more to that at the end, but just kind of keep that in mind. But many of us, so many of us, are kind of like Peter. You know, we want the glory, but not the cross. And that's going to be kind of Jesus' focus in this section. But some of us, we just want to take it the easy way. So I thought what would be good is if we could kind of start off with a little quick tutorial on how to start your day off with a positive outlook. All right? Easy. So all of you are capable of doing this. First of all, you go to your desktop on your PC and open up a Windows. Then you create a folder. Okay, that's easy enough to do. And then change the name to housework. Just give it a name of housework. And then drag and drop it up to the corner where your recycle bin is. Now, when you do that, you're going to open up a dialog window that says, "Are you sure you want to remove the folder housework and its contents to the recycle bin?" Now, watch what happens to the recycle bin here, because you just take your mouse, go over and click on yes, and there it goes. So, notice it's gone. And don't you feel better? No more housework. Okay, I kind of blew the presentation of that, but the scene had been overshadowed by this really bright cloud with God himself saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased," last week at the Transfiguration. Remember, Peter wanted to set up these 3 tents, these 3 tabernacles. And they could just stand up there and get one for Moses, one for Elijah, and then, oh yeah, we'll include Jesus in one too. And we'll just stay up there and have us a good time. And that was interrupted by the Father saying, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." And if you were here last week, he said, "And so you listen to him." Very much emphasis. So looking back at Chuck Spurgeon, he says, it's a better thing for a man to live near Christ and to enjoy his presence than it would be for him to be overshadowed by a bright cloud and hear the divine Father himself speaking out of it. Now, do you understand what he's saying here? He's saying that it would be better to have a life with Jesus, having a close relationship with God, than it would be to be up on a mountaintop and seeing what Peter, James, and John saw, what they experienced on top of the Mount of Transfiguration. And that whole scene ends with, we kind of wrapped up with this last week in verse 8 of chapter 17. Matthew says, "And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only." And what the Father was trying to communicate to them when he said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, listen to him," was that it would be better to have a tight relationship with him, to have him living inside of you and having his presence, than it would be to have a spiritual experience. Today we call them mountaintop experiences, and it kind of comes from Matthew 17. But any mountaintop experience that we have that allows for any other vision other than Jesus only is not genuine. And we'll talk about the purpose of that here as we go through it. Verse 10 says, and the disciples asked him, saying, well, why did the scribes then say that Elijah must come first? Now, they're referencing a passage in Malachi, the closing verses of Malachi in chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, where he prophesies, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the father to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. Come, or lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. And so they kind of bring that up to him and said, well, what about the whole thing about Elijah? Elijah is supposed to come before the coming of the Lord. And so Jesus answered them in verse 11, and he says, indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has already come. They didn't know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands. So when he says that, it says that the disciples then, they understood that, oh, he's talking about John the Baptist. Because remember, John the Baptist had been beheaded at this point, and they realized that Jesus was saying that John the Baptist was, in part, anyway, that fulfillment of Malachi chapter 4. It's going to ultimately be fulfilled in Revelation chapter 11. If you're very familiar with the passage, chapter 11 is where there's these two witnesses, and they're not identified by name in the text, but I believe that it's Moses and Elijah, and they go to the tribulation temple. The temple will be erected during the Great Tribulation, and they will be standing at the gates outside the wall of the temple, sharing Christ with everybody that walks by. And one of them is Elijah, I am very confident in. And so part of this prophecy from Malachi chapter 4, it was in part, let's look at it this way. John the Baptist, the Malachi chapter 4 was fulfilled in John the Baptist as he was the forerunner, he was the spokesman for the first coming of Christ, for the first advent, where Elijah will come back to the temple during the tribulation, and he will be the foreshadowing, the waymaker, if you will, for the second coming of Christ. And cryptically, that's what he's trying to explain to the disciples. Of course, they wouldn't have understood that because they didn't have the book of Revelation at that point. But verse 14 says, and then when they had come down to the multitude, so they were come to the multitude, they were up on the mountain, they came down, and there's this multitude. A man came to him, kneeling down to him, saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he's an epileptic and suffers severely, for he often falls into the water or in fire, and often into the water. Now the disciples, at least Peter, James, and John, the other 9 were down in the valley, down where this boy was, and his father. But Peter, James, and John had their mountaintop experience. They had seen the Mount of Transfiguration. And so they were pumped. I mean, Peter, James, and John were pumped. You know, they were going to go slay some dragons for Jesus. They were ready for that when they came down from the mountain. And that's the time, if you've ever had a mountaintop experience, you'll understand what I'm saying here. But that's the time when you've had that kind of a spiritual high. When you go through that, and then you come down off the mountain, that's when the enemy enters the picture. We even have a cliche in our culture today where we say, I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know, because things are going real good, and you just go, yeah, I know it's not going to last. There's going to be something that's going to happen. The other shoe is going to drop. The reality is going to set in. Well, that's kind of what's happening with these guys. And God gives us our spiritual highs. He does give us these, Pastor Matt, our youth pastor, calls it camp high. You know, they go to camp and all the kids get pumped up and all stoked, and they come back ready to fight the devil for Jesus. And oftentimes that lasts for about a day or two until real life starts happening. And God gives us these spiritual highs, but He doesn't do it just simply to make us feel good. You know, we talked about that last week. That's not the reason why we have those, but it's in order to equip us for the spiritual warfare that's going to follow. That's why that happens. Mark tells us in his account of this that when they came down, Jesus, Peter, James, and John came down and joined the other disciples. He noticed that they were having an argument with the scribes, probably about this situation here. Now, the word epileptic, it says this boy is an epileptic. That's what the dad says. The word literally is moonstruck. In those days, and in fact, many people even today, but in those days they had this belief that there was an effect that happened during the phases of the moon. You know, you turn into a wolf man on a full moon, and that sort of a thing. And so they had even taken had a phrase that they used to refer to people with psychological disorders as lunatics. And the Old King James spells it with a K on the end, you know, using the archaic spelling. New American uses a short version, the way we would spell it today, lunatic. And it's the word. What the word literally means is moonstruck, and the word lunatic comes from a word that means through the Latin. You know, today we talk about a lunar landing, meaning a moon landing, and it was the idea that there was an effect from the moon that. There was a force from the moon that affected people here on Earth. I don't think epileptic's a good translation. I don't think that's what he was. In fact, the NIV, the NLT, and the English Standard Version says that he has seizures. I think that's probably a preferred translation. Any of the modern English translations, the New King James is the only one that uses the word epileptic. The Bible does make a distinction between epilepsy and demonization. There is a distinction between the two. The Bible doesn't confuse the two like many people in today's culture does. In fact, in Dr. Luke's account, in Luke's gospel, he was a doctor, and he doesn't even try to give the boy a diagnosis. He just simply says that it's a demon. And there are many things that can cause seizures. You know, sometimes there can be some sort of physiological issue, like epilepsy. A lot of things that can cause seizures. And there is a difference between epilepsy and demonization or demon possession, we could say. And both have been attributed to the other by people over the years. But before we go into this further, I want us to look at some statistics, and then I'll explain why. Transgenderism in the United States, from ages in the last 10 years, and this goes up to 2025, or 23, that was the latest stats I had on it, but they rose from 0.3%, this is ages 25 to 34, went from 0.3% to 1.7% during that decade. In other words, it just slightly more than doubled, okay, or tripled. In ages 18 to 24, it went from 6% to 3.1% during that same time period. This is ages 18 to 24. 250% increase. Obviously, there's something going on. There's something that's affecting our culture. 60 to 70% of the murders committed in the U.S. have been committed by people 35 years old and younger. 50 to 60% of all the murders are committed by 30-year-olds or under. The average age for a mass shooter in the United States is 33. The most common age for mass shooters is 18 to 29. 50% of all of the killings, all of the people that killed somebody else during 2020, remember 2020? Who forgets 2020? 50% of all the killings during 2020 were under 30. Check this one out. 6 of the 9 deadliest mass murders in the U.S. between 2018, or since 2018, have been 21 or under. 6 out of 9. Compare that with only 2 out of 30 from 1949 to 2017. Something's going on. Why am I sharing this? Why am I doing this? I'll try to explain. And we know from the text that the boy is being demonized. We haven't gotten that far yet, but just as a precursor to what we're going to be looking at, we know that he's been demonized. That's the literal translation of the word is demonized, but our normal referencing of it, he was demon-possessed. Now, the word child that's used in here could use of any age up to emancipation. Any age that would consider to be a minor. That's the word that's used. So, we have this picture of a 7 or 8 year old little boy, but probably older than that. How did this happen? How did this man's child, become demon-possessed? Could it have been through the influences of the father in the home? I would think that would be worthy of a rebuke by the Lord, if that were the case. And he doesn't rebuke the dad. So was the demonization the result? I mean, did the boy get caught up in Dungeons and Dragons or Harry Potter? And I'm not trying to be flippant with that. But there are many activities for children and youth that go on in our culture today that can be incomprehensibly damaging. And oftentimes this happens without loving parents having a clue. I think if we look at those stats, I think that would be a very good takeaway from it. And, I'm not saying that every kid that does this is going to get demon-possessed. That's not my point. I'm not saying that, but I'm just trying to show we have an enemy that wants to take us down. And what's the better way than through our kids? And so no matter how articulate or demanding, and please understand, I'm not pointing fingers. I don't have anybody in mind. I just feel like the Lord impressed this on my heart to share this morning. But no matter how demanding a kid might be about their rights, what everybody else does, we need to understand that their brains are not fully developed yet. The ability to say no is greatly lowered the younger you are, because the brains haven't fully matured. You and I might be able to receive a certain kind of influence, engage in a certain thing or something that wouldn't be considered necessarily sinful without having some sort of negative influence on us. But I don't think that's quite the case for the kids. And so something like unsupervised social media or AI among those who have not attained adulthood up here can be very risky. Violent and occult-themed video games, books, music, movies. There's no shortage of that in our society. And I'm not saying that if your kid has an Instagram, he's going to, end up with his head spinning around in a 360. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that it's something that I think as parents, we all need to be involved in. And I'd be certainly willing to go out on a limb and say that any adult with a fully developed upper story, any adult who doesn't at least agree with the potential of what I'm talking about, is either in denial, they're Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or they watch too much MS Now. I mean, one of those three, And I think we can make a pretty good case for a link between all this craziness and TikTok. I think we can do that. And we look at the TikTok generation, and they would be the ones that would fall in those categories of the stats that I just looked at. Now, for all of you Gen Zers, I know you're sitting there thinking, okay, boomer. And to that I just say, sooner. But I trust that the evidence is sufficient. I really do. And there could be any number of options and influences that are in play here. So we need to be careful to not overinterpret it. But we can all agree that there have been way too many instances here in the recent years where these kinds of negative influences have given birth to devastating results. Everything from online bullying to sexual dysphoria, you know. So this guy brings his son to Jesus, and he says, I got a son who's demon-possessed, I think is what he's saying. I've got a son who is having these seizures, and Jesus immediately interprets it as something that's demonically influenced anyway. And so I brought him to your disciples, verse 16, but they couldn't cure him. Luke's account tells us that he was his only son. Children are indescribably precious. I mean, there is nothing that surpasses that statement. Unless it's an only child. That makes a difference. The guy said it was his only child. Now, his disciples had used the same words Jesus had used. They had seen him casting out demons. In fact, they had done that themselves. Jesus sent them out on missions and said, go do it, and this is what you do. And in that those missionary journeys, they cast out demons. So they said the same words that Jesus used. They had copied his mannerisms. They'd seen how he would emphasize certain words. They even mimicked his voice inflections. They had done it just the way Jesus had done it. But it didn't work. And I can imagine probably the three of them, Peter, James, and John, were thinking things were a lot more peaceful up on top of that mountain. You know, Peter's like, he probably didn't say this, but he's thinking, yeah, I wanted to build 3 tabernacles, but no, you know, you want us to come down here. And so Jesus answered and said, verse 17, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. He didn't rebuke the dad. In fact, it sounds like the rebuke, as we're going to see, was more directed toward the disciples, but he doesn't really orally address them. He doesn't call them out by name. He's calling out a generation. And I don't think he meant like a Gen Z or Gen X or millennials. I don't think he was talking about that. But he said, how long will I bear with you? Bring him here to me. Why did he rebuke them? I think if he was looking at the disciples when he said this, it was because they had sprinkled water on the guy, they'd bopped him on the head, they'd done all the things that they were supposed to do, but nothing, it didn't work. And he calls them faithless and perverse. Why is that? The reason why I think that he is nondescript in who he's addressing here is because he's talking about any generation who thinks that they can get Christianity done by doing it a certain way. There's a formula that needs to be followed. Any generation that rejects the way of the cross. The whole theme of this chapter is Jesus going to the cross. That's what Jesus is trying to communicate to him. I'm not going to take the easy way out. I'm not going to take the shortcut. I'm going to the cross. I'm going to bear my cross, and I want you guys to do it too. And any attempt to try to sidestep from that I think, is who Jesus is addressing here. And so Jesus, verse 18, he rebuked the demon, and it came out of him. And the child was cured from that very hour. You know, I can imagine the disciples, when they were trying to do it, they probably had used every terminology, every phrase. They shouted, they screamed, they just, demanded in the name of Jesus and all that. And it didn't work. And then Jesus said, "Get out." That's all he had to say. And the disciples came to Jesus privately and said to him, "Why couldn't we do that? How come it worked for you and it didn't work for us?" And so Jesus said to them, "Because of your unbelief." Now, I don't know what translation you're reading. Your Bible may say, "because of little faith." That's a legit translation also. Because of your little faith. For assuredly I say to you that if you have faith as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it's going to move, and nothing will be impossible for you. All you got to do is have faith the size of a mustard seed, Jesus says. And he says, you guys didn't have that. Now, John, one of the apostles that had been up there on top of the mountain, John writes in 1 John 5:14, most of us quote it by heart. He said, this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. Would it be his will to cast out a demon? You'd think. And Jesus says right here, if you just have faith the size of a mustard seed, that's going to be enough. In Luke 19, there's the parable of the minas. And it's similar to the parable of the talents, but not quite the same thing. Oh, I forgot about this picture of the mustard seed. Sorry. Many of you have seen this picture before. This is a picture from some seeds that I got from the garden tomb on my first trip to Israel many, many years ago. And you can see these little specks. The big things are pods, and these little teeny tiny seeds that are about the size of a pepper flake are mustard seeds. There's one right there. See it? And Jesus said, if you have faith the size of one of those pepper specks, that's enough. Not only is it enough, but if you have the faith the size of a pepper speck, you can say to this mountain, go from here to there, and it's going to get up and go. Romans 12:3, Paul writes, he says that God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. In Luke 19, there's the parable of the minas. And it's similar to the parable of the talents, but there's a kind of a little different spin on it. And it's about this guy. He calls 10 of his most trusted servants to him, and he gives each one of them a mina, which, if you're familiar with the denarius from the New Testament, it's worth about 100 of those. So it'd be about 3 months' wages. But think of in today's money what 3 months' wages would be. That's about what he gave each one of them one. And then he tells them, Old King James says, "Occupy till I come." But literally what he says, most of the other English translations say, "Do business until I come." Take care of things. I'm going away. I got to go away to a far-off country to receive this country I've just inherited. So you guys take care of what I got going on here, and I'll come back. And he gave each one of them 3 months' wages to accomplish that, to do that work. And so when he comes back, he calls the first guy to him, and he says, he asked to give an account. So what'd you do with the mina I gave you? And he said, I've invested it and made 10 more. And the guy says to him, "Well done, good and faithful servant. I'm going to, because of that, I'm going to make you the Lord over 10 cities. I'm going to give you 10 cities in response to that." Sounds pretty good. He calls the second one up and he says, "So what did you do?" And he said, "Well, I took the mina that you gave me, and I worked it, invested on it, and I made 5 more minas." And Jesus says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Because of that, I'm going to give you 5 cities. You can be ruler over 5 cities." And then he brings one of the other guys up, And he says, what'd you do with my mina? And in the parable it says that he was a mean and austere man, this ruler. He got mad easily, and he says, I was kind of afraid. I didn't want to do it. I was afraid I'd lose it. And so what I did was I stuck it in a sock and buried it out in my backyard. And so here it is, bright and shiny, just like before. I'm going to give it right back to you, Lord. And, of course, the ruler rebukes him, and he says, I'm going to take that mina and give it to the guy that's got 10. Give it to him. And then he says, you're worthless and no good servant. Now, I believe that the purpose of the distinction between the parable of the talents and the parable of the minas is the parable of the talents is about, we could take it as talent, even though the word meant something different in those days, but it's think of it as the gifts that he gives us. Everybody is given a different measure of gifts, different levels of gifts, right? And that's what that one's all about. This one is talking about something different, though. Luke 19 is talking about faith. We've all been given a measure of faith. We've all been given one mina. And he tells us to do business with it. Be faithful with that one thing that I give you. And let your faith grow as a result. Now, there's not a person here this morning that does not have a measure of faith. Mustard seed is, think of these two illustrations that Jesus used. You've got a mustard seed, as we saw, it's a pretty teeny tiny thing. We could say that a mustard seed would be the equivalent of a small infinitesimal amount. That was kind of the smallest thing that they could see, because they didn't even have glasses back then, You can barely see a mustard seed. A mountain was the biggest thing they knew. This is going to be a large, insurmountable obstacle. You can't go through a mountain. You got to go over it, around it. And so the smallest thing versus the biggest thing. That's what the illustration that Jesus gives us is talking about. So if we were to talk about this in our today, in our quantum megacosmological thinking of today, it could be paraphrased kind of like this. I say to you, if you have faith as an atom, you see that little atom up there in the corner? And you have faith as an atom, and you will say to the Andromeda galaxy, be as an antiquark. It will become as an antiparticle annihilation. Or something like that. It'd be something along those lines if he were saying that to us today. Everybody's got that kind of faith. Faith as big as an atom. Faith as big as a mustard seed. Anybody here doesn't have that much faith? Why did the disciples not? Because their faith was misplaced. They had the faith, they were just putting it someplace else. If you think of the word faith and the word trust as being synonymous, they had the trust, but they just weren't trusting in Jesus. They were trusting in what they anticipated the future to be. They were trusting that by following Jesus, there's going to be a positive outcome. We're going to have a mountaintop experience every day. That's where their trust was placed. A.W. Tozer, he says, unbelief is not sure of anything except that it hates the wind and loathes the sunny side of, and if you're not familiar with that word, it's pronounced bray. And it's a Scottish word, meaning hills. Why he didn't say hills, I don't know. But he said bray. Unbelief is not sure of anything except that it hates the wind and loves the sunny side of the bray. And then he goes on to finish it by saying, every man will have to decide for himself whether or not he can afford the terrible luxury of unbelief. Let's look at the whole quote. Unbelief is not sure of anything except that it hates the wind and loves the sunny side of the bray. And every man will have to decide for himself whether or not he can afford the terrible luxury of unbelief. Every man has been given the measure of faith. Every man has been given the measure of trust. Every man has been given the measure of belief. They're all the same words in Greek, just different forms of the same word. And so unbelief is the same as distrust. It's the same of a little faith. And every man, every woman, everybody that's here this morning, everybody that will be watching this online or sometime in the future, everybody will have to make that choice of whether or not they're going to trust God or not. Live lives for themselves or not. Cross-bearing is not, by the way, cross-bearing is not doing what I don't want to do. That's not it. It's not an illness. Well, I got this rheumatism. I guess it's just my cross to bear. It's not a relationship. Well, you know how he is. My husband, he's just my cross to bear. That's not what cross-bearing is. It's not doing something that we don't want to do. It's dying to self. It's removing yourself from the equation. That's what cross-bearing is. We looked at Thomas à Kempis last week. Here's another quote by him. He says, "Look, it all consists in the cross, and it all lies in dying. There is no other way to life and true peace within." And then Jesus says something very surprising and enigmatic in the very next verse. Verse 21. "However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." Now, I use the New King James. That's my preferred text, preferred translation. And I know that some of you use other translations. That's fine. If you're reading from the New American Standard, you'll notice that it includes verse 21, but it puts a footnote that says something to the effect, depends on the edition of the NASB that you've got, but it says something to the effect of, early manuscripts do not contain this verse. You say, oh, it's only the later manuscripts that have that, but the earlier, most reliable ones don't. If you're reading one of the other English translations, the NLT, the NIV, the ESV, they just admit it all together. There is no verse 21. If you're reading from one of those, you'll notice it just stops at verse 20 and then goes to verse 22. And they have a footnote saying some manuscripts add verse 21, and then they say, but this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. However, the majority of all Greek manuscripts do contain this verse. The vast majority, in fact, there's only like 3 that don't. Out of 5,000, there's like 3 that don't. And because they're just a few decades older than the ones that do, they consider those to be more trustworthy. And why is this important? I'll be the first to confess that there's a lot about fasting that I don't know, and you can take one look at me and understand that. Unless you take the fact that I fast 15 or 20 times a day into account, that I'm pretty good at that. But here's what I do know about fasting. And fasting is not always about food, by the way. You can fast a lot of things. You can fast social media. You can fast getting on your devices, whatever they would be. You can fast TV, whatever. But prayer takes us near to God, right? When we get down on our knees and pray, we just come right into God's presence. And it's a sweet time. It takes us near to God. But fasting takes us away from ourselves. And you can see the benefit of that. You know, when we give up something, when we're fasting, and I saw on TV, we just finished Lent, the whole period of Lent last month, and I saw a thing on TV where they were interviewing different people what they were giving up for Lent, and one person said, well, I'm giving up gossiping for Lent. And all the news people were saying, oh, that's a really good thing, that'd be a good thing to do. No, just don't gossip, that's a sin. You don't fast from it, you don't do it. That's not fasting. But it's just giving up. It's not doing something we'd like to do. And so when we feel that drive, that desire to do it, we use that as a reminder to take it to prayer. I think, I'm going to pick up my phone. No, I'm going to pray because I'm fasting from that right now. And so it takes us away from ourselves. Okay, this kind only goes out by prayer and fasting. The word kind there is the word genos. It can mean a number of things. Our word generations comes from it. a lot of words that has this as a prefix. It means race, nation, or ethnicity. But in this particular case, it's referring to a particular class of demons. This he's talking about the demon. This demon that Jesus cast out is talking about a particular, we could say, a level of the demon, particular class. We're not talking, those of you that are familiar with Screwtape letters, we're not talking about this run-of-the-mill wormwood, okay? That's not what he's talking about here. This kind only goes out by prayer and fasting. The point is that the disciples weren't willing to go the way of the cross. That's what they wanted to avoid, because it's too hard. Cross-bearing is difficult. We're called to take up our cross and follow Jesus. Isn't that what the Bible tells us to do? Isn't that what the New Testament says? Another Tozer quote says this: among the plastic saints of our times, Jesus has to do all the dying, and all we want to hear is another sermon about his dying. Can someone say, ouch? I mean, that one's going to leave a mark, isn't it? The plastic saints of our times, and by the way, this was written over 60 years ago. The plastic saints of our times, Jesus has to do all the dying, and all we want to hear is another sermon on dying. Because we are also called to be cross bearers. We are also called to die. Through dying we live. That's not fun. That's how the disciples were wanting to do it too. Again, another Thomas the Kempis quote: if thou bear the cross cheerfully, it will bear thee. It kind of depends on the matter of attitude, doesn't it? We're going to wrap it up with this, which means I'm getting close to about an hour from finishing. My first conclusion would be from Revelation chapter 4, verses 10 and 11. It says, the 24 elders, now these, obviously no time to go in for an explanation, but the 24 elders, I believe, are symbolic of, they represent the saved people that are in heaven in this vision that John's having in Revelation chapter 4. The saved people that are in heaven. The 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, you are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and were created. The bearing of our crosses here on earth, and understand that when we say that, it's dying to ourselves. The dying to ourselves here on earth, that would be an equivalent of saying the same thing. The bearing of our crosses on earth produce crowns that we'll wear in heaven. Now, some will say, I don't really care about crowns. All I want to know is that I'm going to get into heaven. So if I get there and my tail feathers are being singed for the fires of hell, that's okay with me as long as I'm in heaven. Well, let me explain it. This will be my second conclusion. Many years ago, when I was a teenager, there was a place in my hometown. It was a sand pit that they converted into a recreation area. And it was kind of the place for high schoolers to go in those days. You go swimming there in the summertime. And it was a sand pit, so it was clean water. And they had this raft out in the middle of it, boards on 55-gallon drums that were anchored down to the ground. The raft always stayed in the same place. And you'd go out there and sunbathe. And I was standing on the edge of the raft. And I don't remember the exact situation, but I'm sure I was trying to impress a girl that was probably on there. And I was going to show her how good I could do a backflip off the back of this raft. And so I went over to the edge of it like this, and I just kind of did that. Perfect backflip. I mean, I was 10, The delivery was fine. The only problem was that when I went in the water, I kept on with that arc, and as I was coming back up, I hit the bottom of the raft. I hit one of those 55-gallon drums. Expecting to break water, I broke a drum. And it shocked me. I wasn't expecting to do that. And so I just for a split second, I gasped. And I inhaled some water. And then I was fighting to get to the surface. Probably the time between me hitting that drum and me getting to the surface was at most 2 seconds, maybe less. Did not impress the girl. But I can tell you that it seemed like an eternity. Because I needed a breath of air. There was nothing more important to me at that time than getting a breath of air. And couldn't get it. And I panicked. I was panicking. Now, I don't know if this is the illustration is theologically sound, but it certainly is a sound picture of what I'm going to say now. I think in heaven, right now, anybody here this morning that does not have the drive to breathe? Raise your hand. Everybody has a drive to breathe? If you think you don't, just try not to. In heaven, we're not going to have to breathe. You know, we're going to be in our glorified bodies. We won't have a need to breathe there. But I would like to say to you, let's think of it in these terms. Instead of having the drive to breathe that we have now that is necessary for life, we're going to have a drive to worship God. That we're going to be transformed into a new being that's drive will be to worship God. And the crowns that we receive for the things that we do for His glory here on earth will be the standard for the crowns that we receive. You know, the rewards that we receive for the way we serve Him down on earth. For the cross-bearing we do down here on earth would be another way of looking at it. And so when we get to heaven, we're going to have this drive to worship Him, and the crowns that we receive are going to be the ones that we want to worship, that we're able to worship Him by. And the very first thing that we're going to do when we get there, as is illustrated in Revelation chapter 4, is take our crowns off. You know the song? We've been singing it for decades. We're going to take our crowns off and lay them at His feet for all eternity. So trust me, we want crowns. And they are gained through dying to self. Let's pray. Lord, we do thank You for this chapter. We thank You for the illustrations that He gives us. We thank You for the lessons that can be learned from it. God, we thank You for the mountaintop experiences. They're glorious. You give them to us for a reason, and we give You all the praise. There's sometimes during worship or sometimes during just something, praying during a sunset or something, it just kind of peels back. It feels like you peel back the blinds of heaven just for a split second. And that's glorious. God, we thank You for that. But we also know that we live in a very fallen, a very selfish, a very devilish world. And so you call us to bear our crosses so that we can overcome the enemy, so that we can live in victory and be able to bring every thought captive and to be used by You to slap the devil in the face. So teach us, Lord, what dying to self means. Teach us what picking up our crosses really looks like, and let us live accordingly for Your glory. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's all stand.